Welcome back to the Rational Nationalist. I'm your host, Lee Ellis, and last week we talked about how organizations take on a life of their own. For example, a breast cancer charity, once formed, serves not only to cure breast cancer, but to grow itself as an organization, that is, expand its marketing, donation base, the number of volunteers, and so on. In theory, this growth should all go to the bottom line, that is, curing breast cancer or whatever other raison d'etre the charity or organization has for existing in the first place. With some organizations, such as political parties or corporations, organizational growth may even be part of the reason for their existence in the first place. However, even in these organizations where officers and employees are supposed to pursue organizational growth, not all decisions are made for the good of the organization itself. Not every corporate decision is necessarily made with only, or even primarily, the corporation's best interest in mind. Today, we'll talk about some of these influences and how they operate in practice. First, let's lay the groundwork. We talked last week about how all organizations are formed to serve a core purpose or stated intent, as we referred to it. This can be either broad or narrow, that is, cure all disease or raise awareness about breast cancer specifically, and it can even be getting broken down more specific, such as raise awareness about a specific local injustice or some other extremely local issue, like adding a stop sign to an intersection. The organization can also be private or public, profit or nonprofit, and even be general organizations like the government or the PTA, simply organizations that exist for general service or function. At any rate, to serve this purpose, a number of jobs must be accomplished. To do these jobs, the organization hires individual people. Maybe more and more they go to AI or automation, but at some point somebody needs to do something in the real world since the organization is just an abstract concept. The person hired to perform their job is hired to perform this job with the best interests of the organization in mind. This is their duty, often called a fiduciary duty. Most of the people listening have probably heard this term before, and basically it means that when they make decisions on behalf of their organization or engage in any other behavior in an official capacity, this is the only thing they're really supposed to consider: the good of the organization. They're supposed to put the organization's interests above their own personal interests. And again, most people are pretty familiar with this term and with the forms of conflict of interest. Many professions, especially attorneys and pretty much anyone else who takes on clients, basically people who use the term fiduciary duty on a daily basis, have relatively detailed ethical rules about dealing with open conflicts of interests. However, everyone's familiar with that basic concept. If you want to know how good some kid is at music, drawing, or anything else, you probably don't ask the parents. They aren't exactly objective. Now, is that a conflict of interest per se? I don't really know and I don't really care. The point that we all understand is that people aren't always objective in their decision making processes, even when they claim to be or purport to be, and at times even when they think they are being objective. This is why those professions are so nitpicky about the rules surrounding potentially conflicting duties. Even when people think they can be objective, neutral, or whatever the relevant term is, they often can't, to the point that society is explicitly acknowledging that people are, generally, incapable of being objective in certain situations. It's also why the jury selection process has voir dire. You don't want the defendant's brother on the jury. The point about people not being able to be objective, or more importantly, thinking they are being objective when they aren't, is at the core of a larger issue in organizational decision making. Sometimes the conflicts aren't explicit and obvious. However, people will still allow other considerations, consciously or unconsciously, to seep into the decisions they're making on behalf of their organizations. Notice, none of these considerations are wrong, and some of them are met with shoulder shrugs, and justifiably so, right? For example, in professions with continuing education requirements, nobody bats an eye that the conferences are held in resorts instead of motels, for example. Part of the reason for joining successful organizations is to enjoy the fruits of their success, and that's part of how successful organizations attract the talent they need to become successful in the first place. That being said, not everything is so innocent. Something like enjoying corporate perks is above board and harmless, if not the best use of company resources. However, something like, say, sabotaging another department's project to allow your department to finish first is quite a different story. Let's break down some of these issues, looking at how they operate in practice. Now, say you're a career prosecutor, and like any other young gunslinger who grew up watching Ally McBeal or whatever, you're naturally ambitious. Maybe you have an election to worry about, maybe not, depending on how high up the food chain you currently are, but either way, a case comes across your desk. And without opening it, you know the defendant. Everyone knows the defendant. In fact, though you hadn't heard the details, you'd heard about the arrest on the news and jokingly fantasized about this being your big break of a case. Now it's sitting on your desk. If the facts are at all ambiguous, as they often are, how likely are you to interpret them in the defendant's favor? If it ends up being a borderline case, how likely are you to recommend dismissal versus taking your chances, especially compared to a case where you have the same facts but on a low profile case? And you can go even further with this. Pretend the facts are the same, but not only is the case low profile, you have a higher profile case on your desk that you're itching to get to. Now, you aren't corrupt. Ambitious, sure, but you understand and you take very seriously your duty to only pursue cases if you think the crime warrants prosecution and you have a reasonable chance of conviction. Still, you can see why, even with the best of intentions, people can subconsciously be swayed to see what they want or to justify the course of action that best suits their needs, even if it's unjust. In this case, prosecuting a borderline case that probably should have and generally would have been dismissed. This is why media coverage of criminal cases is often so disastrous and ensures that justice cannot prevail over the noise of the circuses they create. They aren't interested or incentivized by getting the facts or serving justices, they're interested in stories. Thus, a complex set of specific facts gets boiled down to whatever narrative sells papers or generates clicks, or whatever story the political or other group exploiting the trial wants to tell. As much as absolute transparency is critical to the justice system, and good, honest media coverage is absolutely needed in certain cases, such as those with political implications, The way society generally responds to high profile, emotionally charged cases is one of the best ways to guarantee that justice is not served. I already talked about the external pressures the prosecutors face to be more aggressive than is warranted or desired. How much stronger is that pressure when the whole world is watching? Oftentimes, this is the point. It's a group that doesn't care about justice exploiting the case to serve their political ends. They'll twist the facts however they need to fit the story. I call this the Nancy Grace effect, and the book To Kill a Mockingbird pretty much shows this in practice. In high profile cases, justice takes a back seat to the narrative preferred by society at large. Media attention changes incentives for those involved in the case, and rarely does it do so for the better. Now, we included a link in this week's article to the Ash conformity studies, and for anyone who's unfamiliar with the set of studies, they basically proved the general human tendency to conform even when the answer should be crystal clear. Basically, participants were given an incredibly easy question like which line is longer, and this wasn't one of those optical illusions where one line looks longer but they're really the same size. There were no tricks here. The question was specifically designed to be super easy and obvious to anyone with a functioning brain cell. However, before they could answer, a couple other participants gave their answers first, and they all answered wrong by design. They weren't really participants, and they weren't really stupid enough to miss the slam dunk question. They were actually Confederates, and so they were in on it. In this case, most of the actual participants gave the wrong answer, conforming to the crowd and the answer given by the Confederates, or plants. Interestingly, however, some even internalized this answer, coming to believe the wrong answer was actually correct when followed up on. Basically, they were successfully gaslighted. Now, if this can happen in a clear cut situation, what do you think happens in real world situations where the quote correct answer is much less clear, but everyone else is shouting the same answer with certainty? This is also how bureaucratic inertia sets in. When everyone else does something one way, there's a tendency to not question it. I once sat outside a locker room for 20 minutes because nobody had tried to open the door. The first person, assuming it was locked, had waited, and everyone else followed suit without investigating it further. This isn't always a bad thing. Chesterton's fence argues that if one comes across a fence in an open field that seemingly serves no purpose, one should not remove that fence until one ascertains the initial purpose for its construction. In other words, don't get rid of a rule, tradition, process unless you understand why it was put in place to begin with. Only then can you safely to decide that the seemingly arbitrary rule is no longer needed. Now, let's return to our friend or hypothetical alter ego or whatever we decided it was back when we were talking about that career prosecutor. Generally, it's easier for them to just go along with whatever their bosses, the media, their friends, and we'll break that down later, and so on want them to do. It's always easier to just give in than to stand up, and again, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. We all have to pick and choose our battles, and we should never assume that our interpretation of facts or our preferred strategy is superior to anyone else's without good reason. For some people, maybe we don't give as much credence to what they think. But maybe when you open this case file, you already have the annual budget review in the back of your mind, and you want to show that you're prosecuting things as aggressively as possible, or that you need more funding, or whatever. Or maybe once you open the case file, something else occurs to you. There are other implications to this case that may or may not be obvious to others. Political implications would be one of the most obvious. Nothing gets you noticed by the boss like charging his next opponent. Even if you can't get a conviction, the media coverage alone is going to give your boss a hands up. Or maybe the case involves something that you find particularly objectionable, like child or animal abuse, so you lower your standard for what you consider to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a legally ambiguous standard anyway, so maybe in this case, you consider yourself convinced beyond a reasonable doubt with 75% certainty instead of requiring 85 or 90% as you'd generally be more inclined to do when interpreting reasonable doubt. As I said, reasonable doubt has never really been legally defined as such, so there is a little wiggle room. And to state the obvious, in the age of political polarization, we've all learned to otherize our enemies. Since we've already committed ourselves to believing the worst in them, it's not much of a stretch to assume this impacts things like, say, the amount of care a nurse gives a particular patient, how a teacher treats a particular student, or, in our hypothetical, how a prosecutor interprets a particular set of facts against a defendant who's either a political ally or adversary. This doesn't just have to be partisan or politically motivated. We've talked in the past about how people have ego needs, that is, the need to see themselves and to be seen as others in a way consistent with their self-image. Some people have a hero complex or a self-image of a warrior for justice, or they see themselves as the modern embodiment of Littlefinger, which I guess would just be Aidan Gillen, the actor's other character from the show The Wire. We've discussed this more and at length in the past episode, It's Okay to Not Know, but many people form political opinions for reasons other than strict policy preferences. The core of most people's worldview is their own self-image, that is, how they view themselves as fitting into the larger world, and society. When making decisions in an official capacity, they are incentivized to behave in a way consistent with this self-image. This includes not just putting a finger on the scale in support of their other group affiliations, but someone who views themselves as a crusader is likely to behave very differently than someone who views themselves as a moderate. A self-anointed activist is likely to show less deference to elected leaders than, say, a technocrat who thinks their job is to simply advise the person who was elected to make the decision. How much this influences their chosen course of actions in an official role can vary, but in the same way Don Quixote went charging at windmills, people seek opportunities to prove their self-image, especially to themselves. Finally, people have lives outside of work, including membership in other organizations. This is clear with conflicts of interest, but sometimes it comes up in less obvious ways. For example, maybe this case involves somebody who's particularly active in a local church. Although you don't know them personally, or even attend the church, you know people who do and you don't want to piss them off. Maybe you're a little more willing to look the other way than normal. Or maybe the defendant in the case is somebody all your friends hate. You don't know them, but you've heard terrible things about this person. Worse, as soon as you mention that you're reviewing the case, you're met with high fives and looks of, "We're gonna get this bastard," from your pals. You don't think the prosecution is warranted, but the mob has their torches out, and you don't want to be the guy who let the local boogeyman go, lest people start thinking you're some type of local boogeyman supporter. You can see how these types of influences might sway you, especially in the more borderline cases. Thank you for joining us this week on The Rational Nationalist. I've been your host, Lee Ellis, signing off.